Hello, CISW members and Nova Scotia College of Social Work members. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm so happy to have you all joining us. As always, it's so lovely to see all your virtual names. Some of you have joined and have already found that chat or Q&A function. If you haven't yet, feel free to type in there where you're tuning in from. My name's Alexandra Zanis. I am the Social Policy and Communications Coordinator here at the Canadian Association of Social Workers. I'm so grateful to be joining you from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. And we are in for such a great offering today. As some of you may know Nadia from other webinars and other big webinar hits. We are joined again by Nadia from the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers to share some more insight and expertise on the connections between spirituality and social work. Before I pass it over to our wonderful webinar presenter, I just want to go over a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Some of you may have also already found that poll. Please let us know either in the poll or in the chat where you're tuning in from. It's just nice to know. Other housekeeping notes include finding your certificate of attendance. If you're looking for that certificate of attendance, you can find it in the course completion tracker. The course completion tracker tracks how much of the presentation you have completed and when you are eligible for that certificate of attendance. Those certificates of attendance are emailed to you after the presentation is concluded, not necessarily when you've hit those required minutes. The platform still needs to generate all of the certificates, so it happens when the presentation is over. And you can check your email or log back on anytime up to an hour after the presentation is concluded and download it directly from the platform. There's also a housekeeping widget at the bottom there, so any questions you might have, you might be able to find it in that housekeeping widget with the two hands in the home. Another little area I would like to flag for you is the handout section. If you are looking for the slides from today's presentation, you can download them directly from the handout widget. So feel free to check out the handout widget. The handout widget also has another webinar offering. We are hosting What Happens After the Election, if you wanted to check that out, as well as our peer-to-peer support group on Facebook, which is your space to talk about the challenges social workers and social work students are facing in the middle of a global pandemic. With all that being said, please take a peek at the speaker bio for today, the slides, all those blue and white icons at the bottom of your screen. I'm on the back end, so please feel free to let me know if you have any questions. I would highly recommend using that Q&A tab. If you have questions that are dedicated to the presentation, we will have a Q&A section at the end. So if you have questions dedicated to the presentation, you may want to use that Q&A tab or tech questions as well, just so that they don't get lost in the chat. But feel free to use both. This is your space. Your screen is completely customizable as well. So take a minute and reframe or resize everything so that it fits better on your desktop, laptop, whatever device you are viewing this from. Take a minute, make sure it's accessible and works for you. With all that being said, I cannot wait to pass it over. So Nadia is joining us, as I have mentioned a couple times before, from the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. We're so grateful to have you joining us again and to share your knowledge and expertise and for this partnership. With all that being said, I'd love to pass it over. Take it away, Nadia.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here and grateful to be speaking. So I am going to try to click to the next slide so that you can all see. Do you all see this slide,
Yes.
Alexandra? You see the spirituality and social work?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So with that, I'm going to be looking at the ethics of integrating spirituality into social work. And I want to begin first by acknowledging that I am speaking from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the 1725 Treaties of Peace and Friendship, and the treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title to the lands covered in the treaty and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between the various signatory nations. I want to invite everyone to please think of the lands and territories from which you are viewing this, of the Indigenous people who lived and continue to live within these lands, and how each of us can hold ourselves accountable to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here and across Turtle Island. We are all treaty peoples. Thank you all. And so with that, whoops, I want to go over the overview and goals. The purpose of this webinar is really to provide participants with an overview of the ethical implications of spirituality and social work, and it's the beginning of a three-part series. So this session is going to focus on theory. There will be a second session that will be a panel discussion with different perspectives of different social workers and experts in this field. And then session 3 is going to focus on practical strategies to integrate the concepts discussed into your practice. And at the end of all 3 sessions, hopefully you'll have more of an understanding of the interconnections of spirituality, ethics, and social work, and be able to also think of some concrete and ethical ways to integrate this into your practice. I do want to acknowledge limitations. First of all, a lot of the research on this topic tends to come from a white Western Christian settler dominant perspective, and our CASW Code of Ethics does as well. I know that that Code of Ethics is currently being revised, but I am in the process. I am rooting what I'm doing in our current code, not the code that is to become. I also want to note that there's insufficient research on the ways in which these dynamics are amplified by minority stress, trauma, and intersectionality, but you will have a chance to hear from some researchers in this field and practitioners in this field at our panel, because there is emerging research on culturally specific manifestations. And of course, I want to acknowledge the limitations of my own personal subjectivity. So I am, in addition to being a social worker, I am also a rabbi from the Reformed Jewish perspective. I am also a board certified interfaith chaplain. I have a doctorate in ministry and pastoral counseling that included training from the Postgraduate Center for Mental Health, specifically in this area. My mom is French Acadian and was born Catholic. My father is a Holocaust survivor and is a Jewish agnostic, and has a lot of questions for how God could allow what he experienced to happen. And I myself am non-binary and queer identified. And while I do live in Canada, and I spent many years in the States, and that of course also affects some of what I will be talking about. So what exactly are we talking about? Spirituality, religion, and social work. So let's begin with talking about the difference between religion and spirituality, because these are often very frequently confused. So social work literature has tried to delineate, and I want to begin by defining religion versus spirituality. According to Edward Kanda, religion involves the patterning of spiritual beliefs and practices into social institutions, community support, and traditions that are maintained over time. Whereas spirituality has also been defined as the beliefs and practices that develop based primarily on personal values about the meaning and purpose of life. And it does often refer to a sense of belief around a power beyond one's own. And there are multiple dimensions to spirituality, from making personal meaning to coming to an understanding of self and to appreciating the importance of connection to others. So there's obviously a lot of intersection between spirituality and religion. I'm going to be primarily focused upon spirituality. Where do I find meaning? How do I feel connected? How should I live? And how is that integrated into social work? But it's important to recognize that spirituality does intersect with religion, and that many of us have understandings of spirituality that is impacted by religion. And so being aware of that is certainly important. But being able to differentiate is the first task, because spirituality is, in general, less visible, more individual, more emotionally oriented and inward directed. That has caused challenges in terms of research. But what research exists does show its importance, as we will discuss, and therefore finding ways to effectively and ethically integrate spirituality into social work is something that we will be discussing today. To the extent that spirituality is can take meaning making and searching through either traditional pathways or non-traditional pathways, many suggest that spirituality is a broader concept than religion. And spiritual expression may or may not involve a particular faith but the question is, to the extent that spirituality is about meaning making, coping certainly is, and religion does oversect, as does culture. So where do we put social work? And that's a question that I'm going to invite us to think about now, but we will continue to think about it throughout, because that's really the first step towards thinking about the ethical implications of integrating spirituality into social work. It's worth noting that Canada's religious composition has dramatically changed and continues to change. This is from 2011, but it'll be interesting to see from 2021 that it does seem that the trend is going to continue, with the religiously affiliated and the non-Christian religions growing significantly. It is worth recognizing the ways in which sometimes a religiously specific approach to spirituality may not be as one that everyone shares. So certainly the growth of non-Christian, non-Catholic, non-Protestant groups, either people who are not religious or people who identify with different religions, has definitely increased and continues to increase. So when thinking about the integration of spirituality and social work, there are multiple areas to consider. First is the social worker's own spirituality and or religious beliefs. Second is the client's spirituality and or religious beliefs. Then there's also the role of spirituality within the therapeutic context. And finally, the role of the social worker in the client's spirituality. And each of these areas have a variety of different ethical dilemmas that we will begin to explore. But first, a very quick review of our current CASW Code of Ethics. And we will go over them in greater detail later, but just so that we're all on the same page. Number one, value respect for the inherent dignity and worth of all people, and to respect the diversity among all people within Canada. And the second value, right, our pursuit of social justice, and really looking in primarily at the values of protecting the vulnerable, the disadvantaged, and the marginalized. 3, our commitment to service to humanity, the need to put others above our own self-interest when acting in a professional capacity, and recognizing our power and authority, and making sure that we serve the needs of clients in the promotion of social justice. 4, of course, integrity, impartiality in our professional practice. 5, confidentiality and boundaries more broadly. And 6, competence, our ethical mandate to always be working to increase our own knowledge and skill in order to provide the most competent and quality service possible. So these are our current code of ethics, which seems really clear, but sometimes in real life, it is hard to fully have clarity. And so I want to talk about a couple of examples. So the first example would be if a social worker A has strong beliefs about topic X and client B is struggling with topic X. So what are the ethical issues to consider? Now, because of time, I invite you to put some of these comments in the chat box. But what are the ethical issues to consider in terms of a social worker that has strong beliefs about topic X? To what extent will those strong religious beliefs potentially impact, either consciously or unconsciously, how the client is struggling with that topic. Does the social worker have an ethical duty to receive extra supervision on that issue, to make a referral, to address some of those things? So that's one example of a possible ethical issue that needs to be considered. Second example, social worker A is not religious and has negative feelings towards organized religion, whereas client B is religious and is struggling with a topic and their religious and cultural community's feelings about topic X. I'm noticing a little typo there. It should say client B is struggling, not client A. Social worker A is not religious. So what are the ethical issues to consider for the social worker? How will their personal negative feelings towards organized religion potentially impact how they help the client that is coping with their religious or cultural community's feelings about the topic that they are struggling with? And to what degree will their personal feelings impact their ability to be impartial and to support the client? So that's another potential ethical issue. And as was suggested in the chat, please feel free to put more stuff, right? How do we make sure that those personal and professional boundaries are clear when sometimes we might have unconscious biases, or we might unintentionally listen in a more affirming way to some parts of what the client is sharing than others? Being mindful of that, this is another example. Example C. Social worker A wants to provide culturally appropriate and safe services to client B, but does not know about client B's specific religious beliefs since they are different. However, social worker A believes that all religions are basically saying the same thing, so uses I language to talk about their beliefs and encourages client B to do the same. So client B would feel, what do we think client B might feel? Perhaps grateful for safe space, perhaps unseen and unheard because client A is sharing their beliefs about all religions being the same or using I language, maybe feels microaggression of someone imposing their religious beliefs onto them. We don't know, right? Every client is different. It is possible for client B to have all of these potential areas. Certainly, we do teach, as is being mentioned in the chat, that we should refer if our personal beliefs will impact our ability to treat. But the question is, how much of our own beliefs do we examine in this? And for example, social worker A may not know about client B's specific religious beliefs. So would it be an ethical mandate for social worker A to learn about client B's specific religious beliefs? Some social workers will say, I don't know about your beliefs. Why don't you teach me? Is that putting an unfair expectation on the client to now be a teacher? Or is it perhaps an opportunity? Does the social worker have a mandate to go and learn about those religious beliefs? So those are some other considerations. Example D. Social worker A wants to provide culturally safe and appropriate services to client B and doesn't want to impose their beliefs on client B, so does not bring religion up. And, is that safe? Another comment that Patricia is mentioning is sometimes we're not aware of our beliefs until we're approached by the situation. And that is absolutely true. And that's actually one of the reasons for this presentation, to help us have a space that is not in front of our clients to begin to think about some of these issues. And while I'm saying topic X could be any number of different topics. And we probably have ethical mandate to do a certain moral inventory within ourselves around our beliefs and begin to think about, do I feel comfortable supporting someone on topic X given my personal beliefs? Do I know about this? The alternative option, right, of the social worker A saying, I just want to be safe. You never know. I'm just not going to bring up spirituality at all. Is that safe? Or is that potentially discouraging the client from accessing coping resources that might assist them? So, what should we do in those situations? These are all questions that we will be discovering and discussing over the course of our 3-part series. Example E, a religious holiday that is commonly observed is approaching. Social worker A mentions to client B as they are leaving their session to have a happy or blessed holiday. These are the kinds of things that sometimes we don't think about, but we just say. And how would that impact client B? Have we given a thought to that? Will it potentially make them feel unseen and unheard in their unique diversity? Will they be reminded of their minority status? Will that in turn bring up other issues? To what extent might we unintentionally cause harm to our clients when we have good intentions and we're just saying have a happy whatever? Example F. Social worker A wants to help client B develop coping strategies to manage stress and invites client B to try spirituality and prayer. Client B is receptive to try, but has never used this. Social worker A wants to help client B and leads a brief prayer that social worker A believes is inclusive, not religiously specific, but makes client B feel uncomfortable because the beliefs referenced in the prayer do not align with their beliefs, and they suddenly realize that. So, in that situation, how does client B feel? Will client B feel comfortable giving the social worker feedback? How will the social worker respond? Will the social worker be defensive? Will they be able to hear that? What will happen if client B doesn't feel comfortable sharing feedback? So especially when it comes to, for example, incorporating prayer or spirituality into a session, what should we be mindful of? All right. So these are just a few of the many potential ethical dilemmas that may come up by either integrating spirituality into social work or potentially by choosing not to be on the safe side. So let's revisit our code of ethics after having thought through some of the potential dilemmas. Number 1, right? Value for the respect inherent dignity and worth of people. So, client's right to self-determination. We should be respecting the diversity amongst individuals in Canadian society and the right of individuals to their beliefs consistent with the rights of others. So how does our ethical mandate to show respect for this diversity translate into what we learn about other religions? How much do we know about different religions? How much do we unintentionally say things if we are part of a dominant religious tradition, like, for example, Christianity, that might unintentionally, without our even being aware, accidentally cause harm to our clients? How much do we potentially run the risk when trying to integrate spirituality into social work to potentially veering into an arena that might cause us to violate some of our code of ethics? We don't understand everyone's perspective. Many of us might believe that we are functioning with spirituality and religious understanding, and we've taken some classes and we are open to understanding, but we still have to be mindful of the ways in which we might be coming across from other people's perspective. Our second value is the pursuit of social justice. So we believe that everyone has to have access to resources to meet their needs, and to really focus upon those who are most vulnerable as well as most marginalized, and working to ensure access to resources for all people. The challenge is, when thinking about social justice, is that there are many people who are in minority groups or who have had adverse religious experiences. And some of them may be coming to us for help to deal with the ways in which their belief system, their spirituality might have been adversely impacted by trauma. It could be conversion therapy. It could be the ways in which the residential schools utilized Catholic or Christian ideas. It could be a question of the ways in which there may be some sexual assault that they experienced within a religious context. So when we talk about integrating spirituality, to what extent maybe they come from a different country where they experienced war as a result of religion. When we're bringing up spirituality, even if we're just talking about spirituality and not religion, excuse me, to what extent does, excuse me, to what extent does potentially bringing up spirituality bring up trauma or triggers related to adverse religious experiences? Being mindful of that is an important part of our code of ethics. Excuse me. I apologize. So I am going to now try not to keep coughing and invite you to think about how to tread carefully when talking about the intersection of spirituality and religion in a therapeutic context. A social justice ethical mandate when it comes to spirituality involves recognizing that both religion and faith itself can be a form of privilege, and it can be a form of blindness. Because if we have not experienced some of the adverse religious experiences that our clients have, then we don't know what it's like to be limited and to not have the ability to access that faith. And so many social workers or therapists who might personally find a lot of comfort in spirituality and religion and faith need to be mindful of the ways in which that can be a form of privilege, and that we need to be assessing very carefully to what extent has religion been a source of trauma for the individuals that we're treating. Have we done our own work in reflecting upon ourselves? This is, of course, always our ethical mandate, but how much have we done it specific to religion and spirituality? Looking at our own beliefs, our own biases, when it comes to privilege, when it comes to social location, when it comes to religion. How can we help our clients access the spiritual and religious resources that they may need, even if they're not ours? And how can we balance multiple conflicting values and concerns? How is social justice related to spirituality when it comes to our clients and when it comes to ourselves? So I want to talk a little more about that as well. Our third value is service to humanity, where we put the needs of others above our own. So obviously, service to humanity, putting others first, involves not forcing our beliefs on others, neither intentionally nor unintentionally. And we're not always aware of how unconsciously, our language might perpetuate certain beliefs. But boundaries are an important part of service to humanity, and recognizing that what works for us may not work for the clients that we are serving. So that certainly involves not trying to bring up religious ideas in ways that may not be receptive to our clients. But it's also about care for ourselves, right? So we ourselves have to have boundaries for ourselves. And for many of us, we may rely on personal coping tools that come from a religious or spiritual framework. And so looking at those boundaries are very important so that we can be mindful of ensuring that we don't overstep them. Nevertheless, for ourselves, spirituality can be a coping mechanism, and it's possible that it would be for clients as well. There are evidence-based ways of integrating spirituality into social work, into therapeutic context. Certainly, coping with stressors can involve ways of making meaning, and the act of providing therapy, of social work, of service to humanity, which is our code of ethics, is in itself a form of selflessness, which many of us might experience as spiritual transcendence. The question is, how can we have that personal framework from which we can draw strength from without it affecting the way we interact with our clients? Spirituality is about recognizing the ways in which we're all inextricably connected to each other. And many would define it as by a power greater than all of us. And while that may speak to us personally, saying this to our clients might potentially cause unintentional harm, especially if they are survivors of adverse religious experiences. And so treading carefully is part of how we put others first. Integrity in the professional practice is value number 4. So one of our mandates is looking at impartiality, right, and appropriate boundaries. And that involves being aware of our own subjectivities. To be subjective is potentially to be discriminatory. It's not intended to be, but it may be perceived that way. And being aware of how that might come across is part of our ethical mandate. So boundaries are about where one person ends and the other person begins. And when thinking about spirituality, the first step is looking at self-care. Spirituality can be a form of self-care. And for those of you who've attended my workshop on the ethical mandate of self-care and avoiding burnout, we have an obligation to our clients to be as fully present to them as possible. And that does involve not being empty and burnt out. So there is certainly an important component of integrating spirituality into social work when it comes to self-care for ourselves. The different ways that we can think about self-care, it's not just getting a manicure or a massage, right? There's many different ways because we are multifaceted. And burnout can happen on many different levels, and self-care needs to happen on many different levels. And so looking at integrating not just physical self-care, whether it's a muscle or something like that, or a massage or exercise, not just therapy for psychological or affirmations, but also looking at self-reflection, our own spiritual processes, whether it's yoga, whether it's play, whether it's religiosity, whatever that looks like, that is part of our own self-care and something that we should be reflecting on. Confidentiality in professional practice is, of course, another one of our values, and that really touches upon boundaries more broadly and being sure that we know what to say and not to say. We also want to be aware that if our clients, for example, have experienced an adverse religious experience by a clergy person, they may have a very difficult time understanding confidentiality. So it might affect how they perceive our confidentiality. Building that safe space is super important. And that means we need to be extra careful in how we tread. We want to be careful to not invalidate someone's experiences by the ways in which we talk about people. So, for example, many survivors of conversion therapy will, when they go to a therapist, will have the therapist say, "Oh, well, that was just a cult. You're done with that," without thinking about the harm spiritually that may have come from that experience because religion was used as a weapon in their conversion therapy, for example. That's just one example amongst many that requires us thinking about how do we bring healing to people who might have been harmed specifically in that area, when we have to first be aware of what is an effective evidence-based ethical tool. What should we be wanting to make sure we don't do in terms of unintentionally causing harm? Being able to look at the role of spirituality in coping, the ways in which mindfulness-based interventions, there certainly are lots of different strategies that can be helpful, but it's important to find ways of integrating that into our practice that does not, that is based on a accurate assessment of what the client is comfortable with receiving. And that's where competence comes in, which is our code of ethics, and being aware of all of the different techniques and strategies as much as possible. The first step is looking at diversity more broadly than we sometimes do, to understand that religious literacy is an important part of professional competence. Learning about the many different religious beliefs that exist, but then recognizing that each client is going to be unique and different. Just because somebody is one religion doesn't mean that they follow all of the beliefs that we learned from the internet or learned from a class. So we want to be sure that we don't typecast people in our quest to learn about them. So ethical social work practice is partially about competence and evidence-based practice. So there are evidence-based spiritual assessment tools that have been validated with multiple populations, and those will be really important to be able to assess to what extent the client would benefit from integrating spirituality into the practice, to be able to identify indicators of spiritual distress, to identify risk factors, to be able to ensure effective outcomes, to look at those. That's part of ethical social work practice. There are a variety of different evidence-based models to ensure spiritual care, and we will be hopefully having a chaplain who, in addition to myself, who will be able to talk at our panel about effective methods of integrating spirituality within a counseling setting. And I will be providing some specific strategies to you in our third session. So this is primarily more of a theoretical, but we will look at some concrete strategies. But the first thing that I want to think about is, what should we do, right? So the first ethical mandate, just thinking about ethics more broadly as a field, is non-maleficence, doing no harm. So if we don't know, sometimes the best thing we can do is to make a referral. Sometimes the best thing we can do is not do anything rather than cause harm. But that's not enough. And if we do that, we run the risk of causing harm by not helping that person access some of their most meaningful sources of strength. So when we are tempted to bring in spirituality, The first step of ethical practice is to know ourselves. Be careful with our boundaries. To what extent is it our need to bring in that spirituality, to bring it up, to talk about it, or to explore it? And to what extent is it the client's? So if we notice that it's more our need than the client's, let's say the client is not particularly open to it, then we should probably have an opportunity to process what's going on inside of us in relationship to this client or the issues that this client is facing, that we are feeling more of a need to bring it in than the client. Step number 2, focusing upon our own self-care and our own spiritual journey. That is certainly very important. And there are multiple different ways that we can bring in spirituality, whether it's through religious approaches, prayer, whether it's through meditation, whether it's through taking a walk. We all have many, hopefully, different practices that we can be involved in for our own self-care. Some people might suggest that therapy and social work in itself is a spiritual process. The question is, can we let it be that instead of trying to turn it into something that'll be spiritually meaningful for our clients, right? The act of helping people understand, make sense, make meaning, that's what we do as therapists. And that might be spiritually meaningful for ourselves, helping them identify sources of strength that they can draw on. And that is one way of thinking about spirituality. But maybe we shouldn't be using that word because it might have a different reaction for the clients that we're serving. Step 3, how culturally competent are we when it comes to religious diversity? How much do we know about different approaches? When we start with a client whose religion is different than ours, what do we have an ethical mandate to go and learn and study more about their religion, about their cultural background? How much should we be doing ahead of time? Is that part of the kind of cultural competence, professional development that we are looking at? Step 4, it's important to use validated assessments. Simply saying, do you consider yourself spiritual, is not evidence-based assessment. It is not validated. It has the potential to make a certain implication to the listener. To what extent is that what you personally as a therapist might value? So looking at validated instruments, which we will have a chance to do in session 3, is important in order to help people think about what are religious beliefs, how do we make a referral to the right practitioner to help them with that, because we're not religious. How do we help people with well-being, with coping, distress, and how can we look at that more broadly? There are also evidence-based spiritual interventions, and learning about what these are, expanding our toolbox, is part of the ethical mandate. So already the fact that everyone is joining us in this is an important part of this, because that is a component of successful spiritual care. It's a component of successful integration of spirituality into social work, and it is what we will continue to be discussing. So more to come, and I am going to open up for questions in a few moments. But November 18th, there will be part 2, which will be a panel discussion, and December 8th will be the practical applications and interventions. Today was much more of a theoretical overview of the ethical implications of integrating spirituality into social work and things to consider as you make this journey. And I have a variety of different references that may be of interest to you as you continue this journey. And with that, I open it up for questions.
Excellent. Can you hear me, Nadia?
I can.
Perfect. So I'm going to also, once I get to you answering one of the questions, I'm going to put in the chat the registration pages for the other 2 sessions. So for anyone who's curious about registering for part 2 and part 3, I'm going to pop that in the chat in just a minute here. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A section or the chat. We do have a couple right now, but we definitely have some time. So if you do have dedicated questions for Nadia, please feel free to type them in the Q&A section. So one of the questions that we have is regarding the role of social workers in stepping away from clients who potentially there isn't the right synergy, and is there a role in ensuring that they find someone who is a better fit? Sometimes it's hard, as I'm sure this person has noted, it can be difficult to feel like it's time to step away. And what is the obligation in ensuring that that client finds the support that they need?
Yeah, that's a great question. So important. We talk a lot about referral, and that's the challenge is number one, to whom should we be referring? Do we have enough, right? Like I don't know which provinces you're from, but in many provinces, there's a massive waiting list that is there. And sometimes clients take whoever they can get. So that is a challenge. So I believe that professionally, there's an ethical mandate upon all of us to expand our own understanding and skill level to be able to work with the maximum number of people that we can. So I would say that that's the first ethical mandate is do what we can. If self-work ahead of time, like maybe this session will help bring up some potential blind spots. Oh, I hadn't thought about how this might impact that. And so that can hopefully begin some of the learning journey that we can do for ourselves ahead of time. Because as was very rightfully put out in the chat box, sometimes we don't know until we're in the middle of helping someone with a specific decision or issue that I have really strong feelings. So that's one component. The next component is trying to, whenever the question about making the referral, and that's not just for religiously, right? Like whenever we make a referral, we should follow up to make sure that that referral was made, to do our part to try to help that person. But we also have to think about how we're doing that referral, because we have power. And when we say, how do we communicate that I need to make this referral? Is it that I don't have expertise in this area? Is it that I disagree philosophically with or religiously with what you're saying? Like, how much do we share about why we need to make a referral? And could that referral be causing harm? Right? I don't believe in topic X. You're discussing topic X. I need to make a referral to someone else. By sharing that self-disclosure, we're casting a judgment that could cause harm. That person may decide that they never want to talk to anyone else. This was the first time they finally got the courage to get a therapist. And so we have to think very carefully about how we make that transition, how much we share about why we make that transition, and then how do we follow up to provide a little extra support to the client. And that's true not just religiously, but in other areas as well, because the client is vulnerable, made themselves vulnerable by seeking our services. And so we have a responsibility to make sure there's a warm handout there. There was another comment. It was just a comment in the chat, but I want to kind of like elevate it because I thought that that was really beautiful. So one of the people said that they choose not to wear a necklace that has a religiously specific identifying symbol on it when they're working with a client, because it might impact them. But when they're not working with a client, they will wear it because they're human beings and they're allowed to do whatever makes them feel good in this world. And that's a beautiful example of a good boundary. Awareness that something seemingly innocuous like a little sign that says, pray every day or something like that, could um, cause potential harm. The magazines that we have in our waiting room, for those of us that have gone back to in-person meetings, that can, someone who's experienced religiously adverse experiences will probably be looking for safe space and looking for anything that is remotely religious to see whether they are safe there or not. So trying to be as neutral as possible within the therapeutic context, ourselves, our bodies, our offices, is important to the extent that we want to try to serve the broadest number of people. If we don't do that, then we have to be mindful of the implications and prepared um, to have conversations with clients about, well, what does this mean that I clearly am part of a religiously specific group, and how does that impact you? Now, hopefully, therapeutically, we're trained to have some of those conversations with our clients, but it's going to absolutely change the dynamic, and we can't pretend that they don't exist, because part of our ethical mandate is to be aware of the ways in which we impact clients. Everything about ourselves might potentially impact a client. And so the power that we have in a therapeutic relationship involves being aware of how our identities, especially those that are obvious, can have an impact on a client.
Mm.
It
Yeah,
doesn't mean it's
excellent.
impossible, but it does mean treading very carefully. And the more we can seek out extra supervision, or
Mm.
mentorship, the more we can uh, do extra professional development, reading, learning, visiting worship services that we don't know, the better it is. There's one book that is a really good book. It's a two-part book, and it's called Being a Perfect Stranger. And maybe I'll try to bring that in. It kind of like overviews all of the different religions and gives a very quick and inadequate snapshot, but it's at least something, right? Part of cultural competency is trying to learn as much as we can about all of the different populations that we might be called to serve.
Mm.
Um, I see another question. Should we conduct a little questionnaire? So yes, I am going to share with you some concrete resources, some validated assessment tools, some skills, some interventions that have been shown to be validated across multiple populations. And it's important to be aware, because I remember I did a research project like 25 years ago, and we were assessing depression and spirituality and coping. And the tool that we used was not validated, and we used it with a different population than the population that had been studied, and it completely not only skewed the results but made the people we were asking those questions feel very like, am I doing something wrong? Why don't I feel this way? And so even a question is a form of intervention, and being aware of the ways in which everything we do, say, how we look, how we present ourselves, what we choose not to say, what we choose not to do, how that impacts. And that impacts on every level, including religion and spirituality, which is a topic that is perhaps more now than ever before, an issue that some people might be needing therapeutic help about.
Hmm. Definitely. Absolutely. That's a great point. It actually does tie into the other question that came into the Q&A regarding bringing up religion with our supervisors. One piece of it is how tired and sometimes overworked we all are and our supervisors are. The second piece being that religion, similarly to politics, can sometimes be a little bit touchy or maybe even taboo, depending on the conversation. So, do you have any kind of tips or pointers for how to better bring up the conversation of especially spirituality or religion with our clients within supervision with our case managers when we have little time and everyone's overworked?
Yeah, so I think that the first step to doing that is, unless we are working in a religiously specific context, is doing our work first to translate into as much as possible universal spiritual terms
Mm.
specific religious ideas so that we can be less of a trigger. And
Mm.
that's true also for politics, right? Like, so a lot of times we don't talk about political parties, but we might talk about specific issues. And that's so it's about trying to find those common grounds. So if one feels a need for our own, right, this is different than working with a client. To me, those are radically different. Working with a client, we have to really, we're in charge, right? And we have power and we have to be careful not to abuse that power and we have to tread ultra carefully. If we are them ourselves seeking supervision, either professionally or for professional development or candidacy or whatever that looks like, we should be able to explore the integration of all of these principles with our mentors. So we should try to find ways of doing that. But we may have an opportunity to learn firsthand how it feels when we get a reaction that is not prepared. And I'd say that that's probably the biggest issue is a lot of times people just haven't given a lot of thought about how these issues can play themselves out in our workplace. But they are impacting us unconsciously at deep levels, regardless of our adult beliefs, because we all have kids who might have inner kids who have our own beliefs and systems. So they're going to impact us. And even if we're not, we live in a society where they are still present. They're certainly less present in Canada than they are in the States, but they are still present. And so being mindful of that and finding ways to communicate that is um, as inclusive as possible would be the first step.
I loved that. I love that. And thank you for everyone asking these questions. They are wonderful and thoughtful. So, yeah,
And
go ahead.
there's one other great, Catherine, you keep bringing up these great points. So, but we want to think also about people who are not religious, right? And many people feel like that's a big taboo in our society to even talk about. And so when we bring up spirituality, that can be a turnoff, even if we are trying to be totally inclusive. So we have to be really careful in how we would even begin to introduce it so that we are able to not unintentionally cause harm by the ways in which we do that. So the first step is we will talk about some specific things, but always when bringing up something that you're not sure how it's going to come across, A, think about why you're bringing it up. B, do some really conscious thinking about, is it really important? Is it about your need? Is it about the client's need? Maybe get some peer supervision or some supervision with someone who comes from a different belief on this issue with you, right? You want to seek out, okay, I know that I'm religion A. I want to find someone in my personal friend group or professional coworkers who is of a different belief just to hear how it sounds. So let me practice it with you. And then also looking at tools specifically to do it. And then finally saying, you know, this word, say spirituality, means a lot of different things and it comes with a lot of baggage. Some clients find it helpful to discuss this, and some clients really don't. So when you do it that way, it's like you're giving people, you're normalizing every possible reaction. You're normalizing that some people are going to be offended or going to be triggered. You're normalizing that some people need it. By bringing it up that way, you're saying all of these options are okay. Know that I'm available to talk about anything you want. Know that I know that it may not be something that you want to talk about. and that I've worked with people in all of those different capacities. And that will be one way to try to approach the topic to create safe space for it without unintentionally causing harm. But then watch. The most important thing is if you know something could cause harm, and that's the first step, watch. Watch for patterns. And does the person eventually not come to your next appointment? Does the person shut down emotionally after? Is their language or their tone or their body language different? Watch for that. And then think about, transference, the therapeutic relationship. How are you going to bring it up? I noticed that you seem to maybe have had a reaction to that. Or when I said this, I noticed your face seemed to change. Like you had an emotional reaction. Can you speak to that emotional reaction in that moment? And that's a therapeutic skill, right? Like whenever someone's talking, they could be talking about blah, blah, blah. And then their face is suddenly crushed, but they feel focused on talking about what they thought they were talking about. We have to dig deeper. That's part of the mandate too, therapeutically, but we want to do it in a way that creates safety, that helps the person feel seen and validated.
Wonderful. Yes, that's so true. Seen and validated. Um, Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wish we could stay here all afternoon and have more questions and conversations, but
But
luckily
there's
for
two more sessions.
I was going to say, luckily for me and for everyone attending, we have two more opportunities to come together and continue these conversations because they are so important. And especially with COVID and everything that has changed in our world, it's even more important now to start understanding how we can incorporate the best practices of every facet of social work within our daily work. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Before I give Nadia the kind of closing words, I just want to remind everyone that your certificate of attendance will be emailed to you, or you can log back on about an hour after the presentation has concluded to download it from that course completion tracker. All of these sessions are going to be recorded as well. So if you had to skip out early or if you got here late, you can log back on and rewatch it anytime, share with your peers, share with your networks, all of that jazz. And just thank you so much, everyone. It's such an honor to be with you and to hear all your questions and comments and to be on the back end with you today. So Nadia, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I'm hoping that this is really like an eye opening for people, that we can see, that the layers of complexity to this issue. And step number one is simply being self aware and letting that be our own fodder for our own growth and reflection, and learning about the diversity of humankind. And hopefully it'll become enriching to us in the process. So,
amazing. Perfect. Well, thank you. We will
thank you,
see you
everyone.
all next time.
All right.